The room was dimly lit, with shadows dancing across the walls as the only light source flickered from an old lamp in the corner. The heavy scent of leather and aged whiskey filled the air, a scent synonymous with secrets and lies. In the middle of the room sat a man known to most as the Shadow. His real name, like so much of his life, was classified. He was a veteran of countless covert operations, a ghost in the night who had saved the world more times than it would ever know. But now, after decades of service, the Shadow was a man haunted by the faces of those he had lost. The lines between hero and villain blurred beyond recognition. It was a cold evening when the Shadow received the message that would pull him back into the field. He had retired to a small cabin in the Swiss Alps, far from the world of espionage, hoping to live out his days in peace. His cabin was modest, tucked away in a valley where the air was crisp, and the silence was only broken by the distant sound of a waterfall. For years, he had lived in this solitude, tending to his garden and trying to forget the bloodshed he had once caused. But peace was something that eluded him. The message came in the form of a coded transmission, a method of communication he hadn't seen in years. It was an emergency signal, one that only the highest-ranking agents knew how to use. It was a call to arms, and though every fiber of his being screamed to ignore it, the Shadow knew he couldn't. The code was one he had created himself decades ago, for a mission that had never been completed, a mission that had haunted him ever since. As he decoded the message, memories of his past life flooded back. The mission had been codenamed Operation Nightfall, an assignment so secretive that even the agency had wiped its records. It involved a rogue agent, once the Shadow's closest ally, who had gone off the grid with classified intel that could destabilize governments. The mission was to find and eliminate the rogue agent before the information was sold to the highest bidder. But it wasn't just any rogue agent. The man the Shadow was sent to hunt down was none other than his former protege, a young man named Alexei Volkov. Alexei had been like a son to him, a brilliant agent with a promising future. They had been through countless missions together, surviving firefights, betrayals, and near-death experiences. But something had changed in Alexei during their last mission in Eastern Europe. He had become disillusioned with the agency, questioning the morality of their operations. And then, one day, he disappeared, taking with him a microchip containing the agency's most sensitive information. The mission to eliminate Alexei had been the Shadow's last. But when the moment came, when he had Alexei in his sights, he hesitated. Alexei had looked at him with eyes that were not of a traitor, but of a man who had lost his way. The Shadow couldn't pull the trigger, and Alexei vanished into the night. That failure had haunted the Shadow ever since. The agency had covered up the incident, erasing all traces of Alexei from their records and declaring him dead. But the Shadow knew the truth, and he had lived with the guilt for years. Now, the message was clear. Alexei had resurfaced, and with him, the danger of the information he possessed. But this wasn't just any resurgence. Alexei was reportedly involved with a powerful international crime syndicate, the Black Dawn, which had been responsible for several high-profile assassinations and terrorist attacks. The syndicate's reach was global, and its members were as elusive as they were deadly. If Alexei had allied himself with them, the consequences could be catastrophic. The Shadow packed his few belongings, retrieved his hidden weapons cache, and made his way to the nearest airstrip. The journey back to the world he had left behind felt surreal, like stepping into a forgotten dream. The agency had arranged for his extraction, and within hours, he was aboard a private jet, heading towards an undisclosed location. As the plane ascended, the Shadow reviewed the mission dossier. It was thin, containing only basic intel on Alexei's last known whereabouts, a remote island off the coast of Greece, where the Black Dawn was rumored to have a hidden fortress. The mission was simple in theory: infiltrate the fortress, retrieve the microchip, and eliminate Alexei. But the Shadow knew better than to underestimate the complexities that lay ahead. The island was heavily fortified, surrounded by treacherous waters and patrolled by elite mercenaries. The only way in was through a series of underwater caves that led to the fortress's lower levels. It was a suicide mission, but the Shadow had never shied away from danger. As the plane touched down on a small airstrip in a nearby coastal town, the Shadow was met by a familiar face, Agent Helena Carter, one of the few people he still trusted within the agency. Helena had been a rookie when the Shadow was in his prime, and he had mentored her during her early years. She was now a seasoned agent, known for her tactical brilliance and unwavering loyalty. "It's been a long time," Helena said, her voice tinged with concern as she handed the Shadow a briefcase containing the mission's equipment. "Are you sure you're up for this?" The Shadow nodded, his expression unreadable. "I don't have a choice. Alexei needs to be stopped." Helena hesitated for a moment before speaking again. "There's something you should know. Alexei, he's not the same person you remember. He's changed, and not for the better. The intel we've gathered suggests that he's become ruthless, willing to do whatever it takes to achieve his goals. If you hesitate again—" "I won't," the Shadow interrupted, his tone firm. "This time, I'll finish what I started." Helena handed him a small earpiece and a tracking device. "We'll be monitoring the situation from here. The extraction team will be on standby, but you're going in alone. Good luck." With that, the Shadow boarded a small boat that would take him to the island. The journey was silent, the only sounds being the rhythmic splashes of the oars and the distant cry of seagulls. The closer they got to the island, the more the Shadow's mind raced. He knew that this mission was more than just a chance to correct his past mistakes. It was a test of his resolve, a final challenge that would determine the legacy he would leave behind. The island loomed ahead, its rocky cliffs shrouded in mist. The boat's captain, a grizzled old man who spoke little, pointed towards a dark crevice at the base of the cliffs. "That's your entry point," he said gruffly. "The tide will be low for another hour. After that, the caves will flood." The Shadow nodded and donned his diving gear. The water was icy cold as he slipped into the sea, the salt stinging his skin. He activated the tracking device and swam towards the crevice, the entrance to the underwater caves. The passage was narrow, barely wide enough for him to squeeze through, and the water was murky, filled with sediment and debris. As he navigated the twists and turns of the cave system, the Shadow's mind remained focused on the mission. He had no room for doubt or hesitation. The stakes were too high, and failure was not an option. After what felt like an eternity, the cave opened up into a larger chamber, where he surfaced and removed his mask. Ahead of him was a metal grate, partially submerged, which led to the fortress's lower levels. The Shadow made his way to the grate and used a small cutting tool to break through. The sound of metal scraping against metal echoed through the chamber, but he continued, knowing that time was of the essence. Once the grate was open, he slipped through and entered the fortress. The lower levels were dark and damp, with water dripping from the ceiling and the smell of mildew permeating the air. The Shadow moved silently through the corridors, his senses on high alert. He knew that the Black Dawn's mercenaries would be patrolling the area, and he had to avoid detection at all costs. As he ascended through the fortress, the Shadow encountered several guards, each of whom he dispatched with swift, lethal precision. He was a master of stealth, moving through the shadows like a wraith, his every movement calculated and deliberate. The fortress was a labyrinth of corridors and stairwells, but the Shadow's instincts guided him towards his target. Finally, he reached the upper levels, where the fortress's control center was located. The door to the control room was reinforced, but the Shadow had anticipated this. He planted a small explosive charge on the lock and stepped back as it detonated with a muted thud. The door swung open, revealing a large room filled with computer terminals and surveillance monitors. At the center of the room stood Alexei Volkov, his back turned to the Shadow as he studied a map on one of the monitors. The years had changed Alexei. His hair was longer, his face more gaunt, but there was no mistaking the man who had once been the Shadow's closest ally. "Alexei," the Shadow called out, his voice cold and steady. Alexei turned slowly, his eyes narrowing as they met the Shadow's. "I knew you would come," he said, his voice carrying a hint of amusement. "You always were predictable." The Shadow stepped forward, his hand resting on the hilt of his knife. "This ends here, Alexei. Give me the microchip, and I'll make it quick." Alexei smirked, a flicker of the old friendship passing through his eyes. "You still don't understand. do you? The agency we worked for, the missions we carried out, they were never about protecting the world. They were about control, about power. We were just pawns in their game, and you're still playing by their rules." The shadow felt a pang of guilt, but he pushed it aside. "You think I don't know that? I've seen the corruption, the lies. But that doesn't justify what you've done. You stole the microchip, aligned yourself with terrorists. How many innocent people have died because of your actions?" Alexei's smirk faded, replaced by a look of steely determination. "Innocence is a lie, just like everything else we were taught to believe. I'm not doing this for power. I'm doing it to expose the truth. The world deserves to know what's really going on behind closed doors. That microchip contains evidence of atrocities committed by the very people who claim to protect us. If the public knew, they'd rise up, demand change." The shadow hesitated, his resolve wavering. "And what about the people who will die if that information gets out? The chaos it will cause?" Alexei's expression softened, a trace of the man the shadow once knew emerging. "Sometimes, change requires sacrifice, but it's a sacrifice I'm willing to make for the greater good." There was a moment of silence, the tension in the room thick enough to cut with a knife. The shadow knew he had a choice to make, one that would define not just this mission, but his entire legacy. Could he really trust Alexei after everything that had happened? Could he allow the information to be released, knowing the devastation it might cause? Or was his duty to stop Alexei, to maintain the fragile balance of power, even if it meant continuing to live a lie? The answer came to him in a flash, a clarity that pierced through the fog of doubt. He had spent too long being a puppet, following orders without question. This mission was his redemption, his chance to break free from the chains that had bound him for so long. He would make his own choice for once. "I'm not going to stop you," the shadow said finally, lowering his weapon. "But I can't let you do this alone. If this information is as explosive as you say, it needs to be handled carefully. We'll release it together, but only after we've made sure it won't cause unnecessary harm." Alexei looked at him in surprise, his guard momentarily dropping. "You'd really do that? After everything?" The shadow nodded. "I'm tired of living in the shadows, Alexei. It's time we both stepped into the light." For the first time in years, Alexei smiled, a genuine, unguarded smile. "Thank you, old friend. I knew there was still some good left in you." The two men worked quickly, downloading the contents of the microchip and reviewing the information. It was worse than the shadow had imagined. Evidence of war crimes, illegal arms deals, and covert operations that had led to the deaths of thousands. But there was also hope, a chance to expose the corruption and demand accountability. As they prepared to transmit the data to a network of journalists and activists, the fortress's alarms suddenly blared to life. The Black Dawn had discovered their presence, and the fortress was on high alert. "We're out of time," Alexei said urgently, typing furiously at the console. "I'll hold them off. You finish the upload." "No," the shadow replied, his voice firm. "We do this together. We fight our way out." The two former allies stood back to back as the fortress's doors burst open, mercenaries pouring into the room. They fought with the precision and skill of seasoned warriors, their movements perfectly synchronized despite the years of separation. The room was a blur of gunfire and hand-to-hand combat, the clashing of steel and the thud of bodies hitting the ground. But there were too many of them. The shadow and Alexei were pushed back, cornered by the overwhelming force of the enemy. Just as it seemed all hope was lost, the console emitted a soft beep. The upload was complete. "Go!" Alexei shouted, shoving the shadow towards a hidden exit. "Get the information out. I'll cover you." The shadow hesitated, but Alexei's determined expression left no room for argument. With a final nod, the shadow sprinted towards the exit, narrowly avoiding a hail of bullets as he disappeared into the shadows. The extraction team was waiting for him at the edge of the island, and they wasted no time in evacuating him. As the helicopter lifted off, the shadow watched the fortress grow smaller in the distance, a sense of finality settling over him. Back at the agency, the shadow worked with Helena to ensure the information was released safely, coordinating with journalists and human rights organizations around the world. The fallout was immediate. Governments were toppled, officials were arrested, and the public finally learned the truth. But Alexei was gone, his fate unknown. The Shadow knew that he had likely perished in the fortress, but he chose to believe that his old friend had found peace in the end. As the world slowly began to change, the Shadow retired once more, this time for good. He had completed his final mission, redeemed his past mistakes, and left behind a legacy he could be proud of. And though he would always be known as the Shadow, he had finally stepped into the light.